Hello students, I'll again introduce myself. My name is P.S. Chani. I'm a professor in the Department of Architecture and Planning at IIT Roorkee, and I'll be going through this NPTEL course on modern world architecture with you. I'm ably supported by my team of scholars Farhan Asim, Shreya Rai and Paulomi Diogaria, and I'm also very ably supported by the e-learning center at IIT Roorkee, Mr. Sarath, who is leading the team here in preparing this particular course, and of course I am very grateful to Professor Ranjana Pathania, who heads the e-learning center here at IIT Roorkee. What is modern world architecture? Where did it begin? What was the evolution that happened over the years? Where do we stand today? Are several of the questions that I would like to answer through this course that will run over 60 modules. Many people have talked about or discussed or debated where modern world architecture actually began, and the opinion that has been formed is that the foundation of modern world architecture lies in the 18th century. It began in the 18th century, that came to be called the Age of Enlightenment, followed by the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. It was driven over these centuries by new materials, technologies and socio-cultural changes. It moves from historical revival styles. For example, we look at neoclassicism to styles like modernism or a movement modernism to contemporary experimentation that is going on today. So, if we look at the forces that shape modern architecture, which we will be going through: industrialization, the rise of iron, steel, concrete and glass in construction that revolutionized building design; urbanization with the rise of urban areas and cities that expanded rapidly and needed new types of buildings; technology and engineering like HVAC systems, structural long span systems, tall structural systems, digital tools, elevators. We will be talking about all this under the ambit of technology. New ideologies in architecture, from rationalism to functionalism to more individual expression in buildings today. Then the global exchange, as ideas began to travel very rapidly, and it created international movements and styles. How will we explore modern world architecture? We will trace the architectural evolution from the 18th century to the 21st century. We will see how architecture reflects the wider cultural and technological shifts that have taken place in this period. We will understand each period's ideas, the diverse ideas, the rise of new types of materials, forms and the key works of each period and each era. We will build the ability to critically connect historical and contemporary works with one another. Repeatedly in my lectures, I will go back and forth between the older and the newer works and show you the links that are there between them. We learn to read buildings as narratives of their time. The beginning. Where do we begin? Like I said, we will begin with the foundation being laid in the 18th century, the age of the intellectual revolution. Renaissance changes that gathered momentum during this time, with the changing social structure from monarchy and religious leadership to pluralism, leading on to democracy in many countries in the West. With the rise of a movement called neoclassicism, we will begin with that. Neo means new, classicism means the classical era of Greek and Roman architecture. Neoclassicism is new classical revival taking place in the 18th century, and how the buildings evolved on the basis of classical architecture. We will study the phases of neoclassicism: rationalist, archaeological, radical and visionary, and see how buildings greatly new ideas transformed these buildings in the 18th century. And then we will come to one of the biggest changes that happened, that impacted everything including architecture, and that was the age of the Industrial Revolution. Breakneck developments taking place in technology, ushering in an industrial society where hand production was replaced by machines, mechanized factory systems replaced home workshops and guilds, and with vastly improved quality and quantity of products being made. Water power and steam power came, iron production started, there was a development of machine tools. This impacted every part of society including architecture. This slide actually shows you the stages of industrial revolution from the 18th century with mechanization and steam power, 18th and 19th century, with close to the end of the 19th century and entering into the 20th century, assembly line mass production, middle of the 20th century coming in automation and electronics, and then in the 21st century cyber physical systems and networks. And all this this will all be in the background as we look at how the buildings got transformed over this period. In the 19th century, many technological and architectural innovations happened, and Britain was at the forefront. We will be covering this whole domain. The power behind the industrial revolution was rail transportation, the most important technological evolution of the 19th century and a key component of the industrial revolution, with James Watt coming in with the steam engine in 1785 and George Stephenson coming in with the first passenger steam locomotive in 1825. We will be covering these aspects. Major step for producing iron as a raw material for industrial revolution, rotary steam power and iron frame construction that began about the same time. The invention of the steam engine also powered factories. Factories required coal that needed to be transported to the factory, so the railways came in. We will be covering these aspects. We will be talking about new materials like steel, which mass production began and became more and more economical, better in quantity and quality, stronger and durable material that led to more slender members. And then we will talk about Portland cement, which was patented in 1824. We will look at glass. Modern glass industry rose for window glass leading to float glass in the 20th century, and later on laminated glass that allowed for very large panes of glass to be used. We will talk about new methods, materials and engineering, the rise of structural design in the 19th century where exact knowledge begins to replace guesswork, the science of static arises and thus becomes a part of architecture. Structural calculations become essential for iron skeletal constructions as well as RCC construction, and now two specializations are there, architecture and structural or civil engineering. But there is an architectural confusion, there is an architectural predicament, and that is we require more and varied types of buildings for which we need more architects, but they do not have examples for these building types that were required. For example, they had never seen a railway station before. So this confusion that happened, how the architects dealt with it, their approach for example was returning to Renaissance, adopting principles of classical architecture, using Gothic architecture, or what was called as eclecticism, a collection of historical styles. We will look at all these solutions and their drawbacks also. We look at, particularly as a separate presentation, we will look at the Crystal Palace, an iron exhibition building, a pioneering building in iron glass, an example of prefabrication and modular construction. It was made using prefabricated and wrought iron elements. We will see why it was so important. Le Corbusier said it was the building in which iron glass vaults were the herald of a new age. It was also a forerunner of high-tech architecture that we will talk about later when we talk of architects like Norman Foster and Richard Rogers, etc. In this slide, do not get confused, this is the Crystal Palace and this is a high-tech building called the Lloyds of London, which we will be studying in due course. We look at a movement called Art Nouveau and the related developments. There were two fundamental movements that we will look at the end of the 19th century. One is Art Nouveau in Europe, began in Europe, spread all the way across the Atlantic to the United States, and then the Chicago School movement that began in the US and then spread all over the world. Art Nouveau began in Europe and spread globally. Chicago School began in Chicago with global impact in the design of the tall office building. In Art Nouveau, there was a reaction against eclecticism, collection of historical styles, and what was called as historicism. We will look at that. It was inspired by use of natural forms like plant and flowers, which was called as biomorphic design a biomorphism. There were use of whiplash lines. Please do not worry, we will come to that specifically what that means, and the use of modern materials like iron and glass in buildings. These are some of the examples of the buildings of Art Nouveau. Specifically, we look at the impact of Art Nouveau, the influence on forms of the modern era, and lead architects that led to evolution of the concepts that led to modern buildings that were to come later. This movement lasted for about 20 years from 1890 to 1910. Specifically within Art Nouveau, we will be focusing on an architect called Antoni Gaudí. You might have heard of him, probably the most famous architect of the Art Nouveau movement, and particularly we look at form finding in relation to Antoni Gaudí. He was a Spanish Catalan architect, most radical, and the work went beyond the mainstream. It had widespread international appeal. If you might have heard of his most famous work that is still not completed is called the Sagrada Familia in Spain. We look at the aspect of form finding that came out through his design of Sagrada Familia. What is form finding? How did it impact modern architecture? We will study that. We will also look at C.R. Mackintosh and the rise of modernism as a separate presentation. C.R. Mackintosh was another important architect of Art Nouveau movement. We look at what was called as mechanomorphic architecture, architecture derived from machines, and this architects influenced by advancements that came through the Industrial Revolution. We will see how they incorporated these concepts and elements which were symbolic of the industrial age into their buildings. We will see this influence of these forms of the modern era, like I just mentioned, and the movement lasted for 20 years. Chicago School and the tall office building will follow, where we look at the creation of the modern office building, the skyscraper, with subsequent impact upon Europe and international works, with its strongest growth being recorded from 1879 to 1910, more or less parallel to the Art Nouveau movement in Europe. We will see how the various preconditions for designing the tall office building were met one by one, leading to later skyscrapers. And we will see the two stages of the Chicago School movement. The first Chicago School that led to the beginning of steel frame construction in tall buildings, something called the commercial style, with architects like William Lee Barangeni and Louis Sullivan. The second Chicago School with the development of the modern glass and steel skyscraper, major advances in structural systems and technology in skyscrapers or tall building design, with major architects being Mies van der Rohe and structural engineers like Fazlur Khan. We will then specifically focus on evolution of skyscrapers, how the structural system, which is the backbone of skyscraper design, the critical role it plays in safety, efficiency and overall design of the modern skyscraper. We will also look at two very important resolutions that took place in New York, the 1916 and the 1961 resolution. Very easy to remember, just invert 1661. These are the two resolutions we will be looking at. We will then study ecological skyscrapers that happened in the latter part of the 20th century, or rather in the beginning of the 21st century. The Commerce Bank, the Gherkin. We will be specifically looking at these two ecological skyscrapers. We will study the structural systems in a nutshell, the types of tube structures starting from frame tube, brace tube, tube-in tube, bundle tube, hybrid tube. We will be looking at all these structural systems in skyscrapers. Then we will come to specific architects and we will talk in little detail about the four great masters of modern architecture. We look at the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, Le Corbusier, Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius. The architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright will begin with the brief biography in a small way of Frank Lloyd Wright, a great pioneer of modern architecture. You might have already, most of us would remember or know about his work, his greatest work, The Falling Water. We look at the projects of Wright, the prairie houses, Roby House in Wisconsin for example, the concrete block houses, and later on projects like the Tillison West in Arizona or the Unity Temple in 1908 in Illinois. Then we will be looking at Taliesin in Spring Green in Wisconsin, like I said, Taliesin West in Arizona, Unity Temple, Falling Water. We will be covering all these projects, and then we will come to the architecture of Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier from 1887 to 1965, probably the most important modern architect in the 20th century. We will study his development of the 5 points of a new architecture and how his architecture grew out of that with his most important work in his early phase called the Villa Savoy in France. Then we will study how he shifted from this international style, and this is one of the styles that we will be studying, to another style called brutalism. In the works of Mies van der Rohe, we will see his philosophy of minimalism, less is more, and how he was the pioneer of the modern tall building and the modern long span building. We look at Walter Gropius and the Bauhaus school of architecture, and we will see how this school became the most important school of architecture, design and art of the 20th century. Much of the architectural curriculum that we have in architectural schools globally is based on the architectural concepts and ideologies that came out of the Bauhaus. We look at the contribution of Bauhaus in India in architecture, in education, and very briefly we will touch upon it, how Gropius, who shifted to the US from Germany, teaching in Harvard and MIT, was a blessing in disguise for Indian students like A.P. Kanbinde and Habib Rahman. Just a footnote here, if you want to study more deeply about this, please go to my presentation on modern Indian architecture where I have talked in detail about this. We will then talk about styles and movements across the 20th century into the 21st century. We will look at the Art Deco movement. We will look at modernism with all its subset styles and movements like Bauhaus, D-style, constructivism, expressionism, the international style, organic modernism, rationalism, brutalism, some of them. International style was a major architectural style with the key principle being form follows function, and we will study that. Brutalism was from the word béton brut, which means raw concrete. Chandigarh is an example of the use of brutalism, and the architect who was most famous for it in the early years was Le Corbusier. We will look at that. The D-style movement was a Dutch art movement that emerged in 20th century and also touched architecture. It was about pure abstraction, the use of primary colors, geometric forms and asymmetrical compositions. We will study that. We will look at constructivism that emerged in post-revolution Soviet Union from the 1917 onwards. We look at metabolism, which is a post-war Japanese design movement from the 1960s. We look at futurism or futurist architecture that came up in the early 20th century and with long dynamic lines suggesting speed, motion and urgency, and it includes the work of architect Antonio Sant'Alia. We look at how modernism evolved into two very specific movements, late modernism and postmodernism. Late modernism began in the 1960s and carried forward the architectural concept of the modernists. It is these concepts which form the foundation on which late modernism was built. Postmodernism also evolved from the modernist movement, but it contradicts many of the ideas of modernism, and we will see why modernism was considered boring by them. It was still influenced by modernism, but it added other architectural languages to modernism. We will study this in detail. We will look at deconstructivism. You would have heard about it. It is much talked about today, an architectural movement from the 1980s with the most important building being the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao by Frank Gehry, how it challenges harmony, coherence and order in architecture. Instead, the buildings are fragmented, chaotic, unpredictable, but this chaos is precisely planned. How this breaks away from traditional design rules, we will look at several buildings to study this. We look at critical regionalism, which is a merging of global and local language of architecture. Then we will specifically talk of high-tech architecture or high-tech buildings an architectural style from the 1970s in which the mechanical and structural systems of building were exposed on the outside. The tagline being, when buildings wear their technology on the outside, and we will study this in detail. Then we will look at high tech, particularly with regard to places to work, that is office buildings, corporate buildings. We will look at the pioneering example of the Willis Faber Domus by Norman Foster, which was an energy conscious design, a very good overall thermal performance. Why is this building important? What role did it play? We will look at that. We will also talk about a little bit about the edge, that shows how high-tech architecture movement has evolved into the 21st century, where high-tech architecture has become more about substance than style. What is this issue of style? What is the issue of substance? We will be looking about that in detail. We will then come to places to move, places like airports and railway stations, and we will see how they have evolved. Like railway stations have evolved from just being mere transit hubs to urban landmarks, how they blend technology, architecture and user experience and become iconic objects of architecture and technology. We look at airports, which are no more just standalone airports, but they are airport cities called Erythropolis. What are they? Where are they reflected? What are the examples? We will be studying that in slight detail. Then we will come to places to live, houses, residential buildings. We will be looking at open interior spaces and free flowing plans that started coming in with the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright. We will see how double-eyed glass spaces came in space and how interiors with free plans started looking as we moved into the 20th and then into the 21st century. How buildings, residential buildings, so many of them were very free flowing interiors but basically glass boxes, and how these glass boxes look from the 1950s into the 21st century. We look at places to gather, museums, art galleries, how they are changing. Earlier, museums and art galleries were formal, exclusive temples of culture. Now they are open, inclusive, multi-use spaces for people, ideas and interaction. How these spaces have changed from examples like the New National Gallery in the 1950s by Mies van der Rohe to adaptive reuse projects like the Tate Modern Art Gallery by Herzog and de Meuron. We look at green buildings. So we're talking so much about sustainability and green building design today. What are green buildings? They lead to reduction of negative environmental impacts through design, construction and operation. We look at that through several examples. We look at buildings with die-grid frames, something which is very different from the normal structural frame that we will be talking when we talk about structures in skyscrapers. This is about a diagonal grid and how it leads to greater structural efficiency and much more aesthetic potential in contemporary architecture. We will talk about adaptive reuse, that is a process of adapting buildings to new uses while retaining their historic features, and why is it so important with regard to sustainability aspects today. In the end, we will come to how several important figures of architects from the modern to the contemporary times. Now when I say modern to contemporary, what does it mean? Modern architecture usually refers to the architecture of the 20th century. Contemporary architecture refers to the architecture of today in the 21st century, and we will cover this journey through these visionaries who shaped our built environment. From modernism to contemporary global architecture, we will explore how innovation, technology, sustainability and cultural identity became the backbone of their architecture. We will then in the end have a glimpse of contemporary architecture and the way ahead, with an introduction to the key concepts and global trends. Of course, this aspect of these concepts and global trends would have been covered when we will see all these various building typologies, but in the end I will conclude by giving you a glimpse of the world into which architecture is moving in the days to come. Let's hope that you will have a wonderful time through this 60 module series. I have learned much in preparing these lectures. I hope you also have a fun time as you go through these lectures and you learn something new about modern world architecture. Thank you.